Without a doubt, one of the principal contributing factors to the decisive Allied victories in the Second World War was a group of outstanding military and naval leaders. This video series gives us an intimate look into the lives of 12 of these distinguished soldiers, sailors, and Marines: Marshall, Eisenhower, MacArthur, Bradley, Patton, Arnold, Doolittle, Stilwell, Nimitz, Van de Grift, Cates, and Smith. The theater commanders are Generals Dwight D. Eisenhower, Douglas MacArthur, Joseph Stilwell, and Admiral Chester Nimitz. The field commanders are Army Generals George Patton and Omar Bradley, and Marine Generals Alexander Van de Grift, Clifton Cates, and Holland Smith. George Marshall is the Chief of Staff, Henry Arnold is the Air Force Chief, and James Doolittle, the 8th Air Force Commander. It goes without saying that this selection does not mean to downgrade the accomplishments of other great commanders. These have been selected because they are best known. The viewer, especially the young viewer, will have some basis on which to be familiar with them. This volume, dealing with Eisenhower and MacArthur, is particularly interesting because of the contrast in their personalities. MacArthur was 10 years older than my father, and of course the reason why I spent my high school years in Manila was that Major, later Lieutenant Colonel Eisenhower, was General MacArthur's Chief of Staff. MacArthur had been a brigadier general in the First World War, the son of General Arthur MacArthur, a Civil War hero and the foremost general of the Army at the turn of the century. Before his retirement in 1935, Douglas MacArthur had been Chief of Staff, U.S. Army. That his subordinate would one day command one theater of war while he commanded another could never have crossed MacArthur's mind. It is not surprising that these two strong personalities had their differences. They did, however, correspond a bit in the years between Dad's departure from the Philippines and Pearl Harbor. My father never criticized MacArthur in my presence, though he admitted to some bewilderment at MacArthur's theatrics. MacArthur, however, felt strongly that Eisenhower's European theater of operations was accorded too much priority over his own Southwest Pacific, and those feelings may have become personal.
The time is June 1945. The occasion, the return to his homeland of a war hero whose stature has seldom been matched in the esteem of his countrymen. The European phase of the greatest war America ever fought is over, and part of the warmth with which the people of Abilene, Kansas, greet General Dwight D. Eisenhower reflects the deep joy of a nation approaching peace again. Some of it is the kind of welcome any hometown might give a favorite son who has done a good job. But more than anything else, it is a tribute. A gratitude felt in every corner of the Allied world, no less than in Abilene, toward the man who stewarded the crusade to its victory. It was a crusade with many battles and many triumphs, but it found its symbol in one day above all others. D-Day, June the 6th, 1944. The invasion of Fortress Europe was one of the greatest military adventures of all time. Upon the outcome of this bold adventure hung the fate of war and freedom. It was because so much of man's hope had been bound up in the success of this adventure that the architect of that success found the hearts of the people open to him from Europe to the town of his boyhood, where the adventure of Dwight D. Eisenhower, the man, began. Abilene, Kansas, today, a busy and proud town of almost 7,000 people living in the heart of the western wheatland, is typical of the kind of town that comes to mind with the phrase, grassroots America. The mark of the past is on it, but it does not live in the past. Its streets and its buildings bear testimony to a living and growing America. One of its newest and proudest buildings is the Eisenhower Museum, which carries forth the spirit and the history of the Eisenhower family of Abilene. It is visited daily by citizens from all parts of the country, ranging from dignitary to schoolboy. Inside the museum, the life of Dwight Eisenhower, boy and man, is depicted in a series of murals. From infancy, that life had the flavor of grassroots America about it. Eisenhower was born in 1890 in Denison, Texas, of parents whose families had migrated to Pennsylvania from Europe and thence to the American Midwest. Young Eisenhower's parents had lived in Abilene before his birth, and it was to Abilene, once the wild town at the end of the Chisholm Trail, now a peaceful village of the plains, that they returned when he was an infant. And it was here that he grew to maturity through a childhood that was active, eager, and happy. An experience shared with devoted parents and spirited brothers. A childhood as rich in the important things of life as ever graced the development of any man. It was an active boyhood in which sports played an important part. He excelled at baseball, both in school and on a vacant lot next to his home. But football was his first love, and his high school coach called him the most outstanding tackle in the valley. The active life was important, but the greatest single staple of the Eisenhower family life was religious observance. The family home in Abilene shows the influence of that serious religious conviction. The Bible was the guide of family life, and its chronicler as well. On the wall of the bedroom shared by Dwight and his brother Edgar still hangs this simple testament of faith, "Thy will be done." It was a home of patriotism as well as faith, and of respect for things of the mind. Work, constant and hard work, was also a staple of the family routine. The creamery where young Eisenhower worked during his spare time while he was in school is still one of Abilene's light industries. In this way, and by these standards, young Dwight Eisenhower grew to a manhood the world would one day know well. He was 20 when he left Abilene for the military academy at West Point. Many a great American has begun his march into history as a cadet on the plane at West Point. Eisenhower was graduated from the military academy in 1915 and commissioned a second lieutenant of infantry. A new phase of life was beginning. In the summer of 1916, as a newly promoted first lieutenant stationed at Fort Sam Houston, Texas, he married Mamie Geneva Dowd of Denver. Events in Europe were forging a new phase of life for the entire world. World War I gave many a future general his first experience with combat. But young Eisenhower was not among them. World War I brought him instead command of a tank training center at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where he prepared troops of the new tank corps for overseas duty. His performance won for him the Distinguished Service Medal, but before he was able to get to Europe, the war ended. In the late 1920s, after graduation from the Command and General Staff School, Major Dwight D. Eisenhower was assigned to France to prepare a guidebook on American battlefields in Europe. It was his first direct experience with that continent. With the 30s came other assignments, climaxed by service under General Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines. For 4 years he worked with MacArthur, who was Commander-in-Chief of the Philippine Army, to help the Commonwealth government work out a plan for its military defense. Ordered back to the States in December 1939, Lieutenant Colonel Eisenhower went to Fort Lewis, Washington, as executive officer of the 15th Infantry Regiment. In the dark spring of 1940, German armored divisions were crashing through Holland and Belgium. The Luftwaffe was streaking its destruction through Europe's skies. France was prostrate, and beleaguered Britain was standing alone. The United States had passed the Selective Service Act to prepare for what inevitably lay ahead. And the biggest challenge in Colonel Eisenhower's life was to aid in that preparation. Late in 1940, he was made Chief of Staff of the 3rd Division, where his staff work brought him assignment as Chief of Staff of the 9th Corps. In the summer of 1941, Colonel Eisenhower became Chief of Staff to General Walter Kruger, whose newly organized 3rd Army was preparing to participate in the most realistic war maneuvers yet held by American troops. In these maneuvers over the Louisiana countryside, as America fought for the time to train its growing army of citizen soldiers, Eisenhower's task was to work out a plan of defense against an invading mechanized force. Soon after the maneuvers were over, Eisenhower was promoted to Brigadier General, and within a matter of days came the bombing of Pearl Harbor. From almost this moment on, the fate of the nation and the fate of General Dwight D. Eisenhower would be inextricably bound together. Called to Washington in the first weeks after the war began, Eisenhower went to work in the War Plans Office of the War Department. Among the plans formulated during this time was the central strategic determination to make an eventual attack across the English Channel the principal Allied offensive effort. A mural covering the west wall of the Eisenhower Museum dramatizes the high spots of the next great sequence in the adventure involving the nation and the man, whose ability to rise to grave responsibilities brought him rapid promotions. Because an all-out Channel invasion would be impossible before 1944, and because the need for offensive action was immediate in 1942, the Allies undertook, as a combined operation, under the command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the invasion of North Africa. The minimum objective of this maneuver was to seize the main ports between Casablanca and Algiers. Along the rim of the North African coast, troops were ashore in late November, encountering resistance ranging from mild at Algiers to surprisingly stiff at Casablanca. The commander's hope was to push quickly east along the Mediterranean and take the important posts of Bizerte and Tunis. But a number of unfavorable circumstances, including treacherous weather conditions, prompted the commander to hold off on this vital assault. In the spring, however, troops of Omar Bradley's 2nd Corps were able to take Bizerte, and at the same time Tunis fell to the British 1st Army. And with these victories came the end of the Axis Empire in Africa. The Allied leaders and the men who had fought under them proudly commemorated their victory. One of the greatest products of this victory, in the words of the commander himself, was the progress achieved in the welding of Allied unity and the establishment of a combat team that was already showing the effects of a growing confidence and trust among all its members. The successful end of the campaign brought personal recognition of Eisenhower throughout the world as a great leader, but the commander himself interpreted this recognition as proof that free men can find in unity the way to victory, even against seemingly invincible odds. The next big campaign, the invasion of Sicily, brought further demonstration of this basic truth. Allied troops took this vital rock in the summer of 1943. The effect of Sicily's fall was electric. Italy surrendered, the first of the Axis partners to capitulate. And now the Allies prepared for what was to be the most fiercely fought battle of the Mediterranean War. The invasion of Italy itself at Salerno. Through a miracle of courage and tenacity, troops of General Mark Clark's Fifth Army established a beachhead against overwhelming German odds and went on to take Salerno and the vital port of Naples. With these victories, although heavy fighting and important battles lay ahead, the first major objectives of the Italian campaign were accomplished. Allied forces were on European soil and would be able to pin down German troops far from the scene of the cross-channel invasion planned for the following year. President Roosevelt visited the combat area with General Eisenhower when he came over for the Cairo and Tehran conferences, where agreement was once again established that the principal Allied effort would be the invasion of Europe. Shortly afterward, the man who would command this awesome undertaking was named General Dwight D. Eisenhower, whom people throughout the free world were now calling the man of the hour. On the opposite wall of the museum, another mural depicts some of the major episodes in the Great Crusade which liberated Europe. The Supreme Commander's orders from the combined Chiefs of Staff were quite simple: to land on the coast of France and thereafter to destroy the German ground forces. Between the order and its execution lay an agony of effort. Across the Channel, the heavy fortifications lining the coast of France bespoke the Nazis' belief that they could push the invading armies back into the sea. In France alone, 58 German divisions were waiting. Preparing for the invasion was a job without let-up. Incessant and realistic training was of paramount importance. The challenges of morale, the myriad details of coordination on every level, all these were overwhelming. But through those tense months in the early part of 1944, the preparations continued. And finally, after being postponed one day because of weather conditions, the eve of the day of decision was at hand. The commander visited the airborne troops who would lead the invasion. I found the men in fine fettle, he wrote later, joshingly admonishing me that I had no cause for worry. D-Day, with the fate of the war hanging in the balance. 500,000 troops, backed by millions more, faced outward across the stormy sea. On beaches that dotted the French coast of the Channel, British, Canadian, and American troops touched shore. The first fateful moment passed, and Allied troops were holding on French soil. 1 week after the landings, the commander was able to say to the vast armies under him, "Your accomplishments in the last 7 days of this campaign have exceeded my highest hopes." Less than 2 months after the invasion, the Allied force broke out of the beachhead perimeter in the hedgerow country around St. Lo. Of the breakout was the next step. And now there began the dramatic pursuit, spearheaded by General George S. Patton's armored force across the heart of France. And then the grand triumphant march through Paris, which was freed by French troops and soldiers of the U.S. Fifth Corps. Beyond Paris lay the liberation of Belgium and the yard-by-yard struggle across the German border. Blocking the steady pursuit of victory lay the Nazi counteroffensive in the Ardennes sector, known as the Battle of the Bulge. Through a grim and bleak period of several weeks, the enemy, supported by the most devastating of weather conditions, isolated and assaulted Allied forces. General Eisenhower called upon all troops to rise to new heights of courage and effort. The brave men of the beleaguered forces held and steadily began pressing the enemy back. And from that moment onward, the Supreme Commander counted on weakened Nazi resistance. The bridge at Remagen across the Rhine, one of the sturdiest symbols of the war. With its crossing in March 1945, the heart of the enemy's defenses was cracked. There remained the substantial task of mopping up what was left of the enemy west of the Rhine. And accepting his surrender in the droves that began to appear. The great cities of the enemy's fatherland were rubble as Allied troops moved through them in the last stages of the enemy's defeat. Both commander and GI were able to find the exultation that comes when victory is close. Victory came finally with the German surrender in a schoolhouse at Reims on May the 7th, 1945. The return to peace was signaled by the Supreme Commander.
Proud privilege of speaking for a victorious army of almost 5 million fighting men. They and the women who have so ably assisted them constitute the Allied expeditionary forces that have liberated Western Europe. They have captured or destroyed enemy armies totaling more than their own strength. Merely to name my principal subordinates in the Canadian, French, American, and British forces is to present a picture of the utmost in efficiency, skill, loyalty, and devotion to duty. The United Nations will gratefully remember Tedder, Montgomery, Spaatz, Bradley, Villatte, Creer, and many others. But all these agree with me in the selection of the truly heroic figure of this war. He is G.I. Joe, and his counterpart, in the air, the Navy, and the merchant marine of every one of the United Nations. He has braved the dangers of U-boat infested seas. He has surmounted charges into desperately defended beaches. He has fought his tedious, patient way through the ultimate in fortified zones. He has endured cold, hunger, fatigue. His companion has been danger. Death has dogged his footsteps. He and his platoon commanders have given us an example of loyalty, devotion to duty, and indomitable courage that will live in our hearts as long as we admire those qualities in men.
And now the long and happy road home. For Dwight Eisenhower, that road was paved with the cheers of the people of the Allied countries. In his own homeland, a hero's welcome awaited him. America's greeting for a favorite son. Here, the story of Dwight D. Eisenhower might well have ended, on this note of triumphant acclaim for a job so splendidly done. But America had other tasks waiting for its favorite soldier. Eisenhower succeeded General Marshall as the Army's first post-war Chief of Staff. He expressed the belief that one of the greatest pillars of world peace is a strong United States. He visited troops stationed in various parts of the world to show America's growing sense of global responsibility. We must remain, he said, the first champions of those who seek to lead their own lives in peace with their neighbors. Finally, on February the 7th, 1948, the general from Abilene, after 36 years of service to his country, left active military assignment. But not active participation in the life of his nation. He accepted an invitation from Columbia University to serve as president of that great institution, enabling him, so he thought at the time, to devote the remainder of his useful life to the challenges of education. But events of the post-war world dictated otherwise. The urgent necessity for unity in the free world brought into being the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And it was evident that only one man could make that vital and complicated organization work from the outset. Dwight D. Eisenhower. At the end of 1950, he answered his country's call once more. And once more, he was on European soil to assume supreme command of the land, the sea, and the air forces of a grand defensive alliance. Against the new threat rising from the Soviets, who had once been his nation's ally, he had to create in the war-weary European soul the will to defend itself, so that freedom so dearly bought would not be lost. For more than a year, he labored diligently at his task of coalition. When he turned over the reins of command to General Matthew Ridgway, the structure of military unity among free nations, on which rested the hope for continued peace, was established. Once again, with the accomplishment of substantial victory behind him, this might well have been the end of his public career. And in a sense it was, the closing chapter in the story of Eisenhower the soldier. History is recording today the story of Eisenhower the statesman. The stories may be separate, but soldier and statesman, they are the same man, Dwight D. Eisenhower, citizen of the United States, spokesman for and symbol of the free world. And son of Abilene. As rich a study as this nation has produced of the capacity for greatness which lies at its grassroots.
Nobody will contest that MacArthur, like British General Bernard Montgomery, had a well-developed ego. And like Monty and Patton, he possessed a flair for the dramatic. Nevertheless, Even his critics in the Far East admitted that he waged an intelligent campaign during World War II, utilizing his advantage in naval and air superiority to bypass resistance and hit the enemy's rear.
I am closing my 52 years of military service. When I joined the Army, even before the turn of the century, it was the fulfillment of all my boyish hopes and dreams. The world has turned over many times since I took the oath on the plain at West Point.
Indeed, much has happened to the world since Douglas MacArthur took the oath at West Point, and in the wars and the periods of peace since, he has often been a central and dramatic figure. The beginning of an extraordinary career. Young Douglas with his father, General Arthur MacArthur, boy colonel in the Civil War, and veteran of the Philippine campaign in the Spanish-American War. One day when the son was 13 years old, his father is said to have remarked, "I think there is the material of a soldier in that boy," a truth that was soon made clear. Entering West Point, he showed extraordinary brilliance in his studies, attaining an average that was the highest in a quarter of a century, and he won the coveted A in athletics as well. 25 years later, he was to lead the American team in the World Olympic Games. Meanwhile, the campaign in the Philippines was being brought to a successful completion under his father's able leadership. The son was eager to visit these battlefields, and after West Point, his first assignment was to survey areas of these islands. One of these was the Bataan Peninsula, where he was to fight many years later in a desperate but heroic struggle. During the following years, Lieutenant MacArthur had opportunities to study the entire Far Eastern area, gaining an insight into the attitudes and feelings of peoples hardly known by the West. At the beginning of World War I, the plan was to use only regular Army divisions to oppose the powerful German Army. Meanwhile, outside these divisions, America had many trained and able men. A proposal for a new division of National Guard units from as many states as possible was vigorously advocated by a Major Douglas MacArthur. Said he, "It will spread over the whole country like a rainbow." The idea for the Rainbow Division, the 42nd, was his, and he worked constantly to see that the division was well trained and equipped for the raging battle that awaited it in France. Division moved up to the front. Its full readiness, through the efforts of Colonel MacArthur, the division's chief of staff, was to prove fortunate indeed. It was during this period, too, that an impressive battlefield tactician began to prove himself and to foreshadow a great military future. For brilliant decisions on the battlefield, Colonel MacArthur was also to gain a reputation as a man who faced danger completely unafraid. Before long, he was in command of the Rainbow Division, the youngest American division commander in the war. Twice wounded, twice gassed, he won more awards for valor than has ever been awarded to an American soldier, and was acclaimed by the Secretary of War and General Pershing as the greatest frontline general of the war. Returning to West Point, he became the youngest superintendent the Academy had ever had. Here he broadened the curriculum to include a full college education and introduced a now widely followed program of intramural athletics. Today, here, he is a symbol and an inspiration. In 1930, MacArthur was appointed Chief of Staff with the rank of full general. During his term of office, much of his time was spent in building an army that had been pared down to only 60,000 combat soldiers, a most difficult effort when an attitude of pacifism dominated the nation. In keeping with his principle of examining the military situation at close range, he toured Europe to observe the forces of other nations. In France, he was recognized once more for his outstanding military contribution to the Allied cause. In Germany, he foresaw the build-up for war. Back home, he begged his country and Congress to realize that the United States was in danger. As Chief of Staff, he foresaw the need for a new type of army, mechanized, mobile, and insisted that our defense force become capable of rapid expansion. Recognizing his abilities, President Roosevelt broke precedent by reappointing the youngest Chief of Staff we have ever had to a second term. In the 20s, MacArthur had served in the Philippines, and in the 30s he was asked to return as their military advisor. A deep mutual regard between the Filipinos and MacArthur grew during this period. It was the basis for a gallant defense that was to come. In 1935, he began a 10-year plan to build up the defense of the Philippines. In World War II, it was to be these forces that MacArthur would lead in a desperate fight, and on this ground. But now the leader, at 57, having served in the United States Army for 34 years, decided to retire. 4 years later, it was as though his military career were just beginning. A few months before the attack upon Pearl Harbor, MacArthur had been recalled to active service in the Philippines. On the day after Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, too, were under attack. Defense here was pitifully hampered by lack of men and planes. With his knowledge of past campaigns, particularly those of his father in this very area, MacArthur withdrew his meager forces into the mountains of the Bataan Peninsula. From the rocky fortress of Corregidor, he directed an operation as crucial as any in the war. This early campaign in the Philippines, the heroic fighting by a lonely army of Filipinos and Americans for almost half a year, caused a critical delay in the Japanese timetable of attack. Back at home, the leader of the first desperate ground fighting became a symbol to a nation just beginning to gird itself for all-out war. The people found in him what they were beginning to discover in themselves, a spirit of intense determination. Suddenly, MacArthur was ordered by President Roosevelt, who regarded him as our greatest general, to leave to carry on the fight from Australia. Leaving the Philippines hurt him deeply. As always, he wished to be at the front, beside his comrades. When finally they were forced into the infamous March of Death on Bataan, his promise to them was, "I shall return." They believed him implicitly. Until his arrival in Australia, the plan had been to await the Japanese attack and prepare as well as possible. Then it became apparent that the new Southwest Pacific commander had another plan. He had meant exactly, "I shall return." He was determined to carry the war to the enemy, to New Guinea, which was the direct route back to the Philippines. A long struggle lay ahead against huge numbers on countless islands. There seemed to be but one way: blast the enemy from every one of his island positions in the Pacific. Victories came, but they were costly. Was there some other way? Knowing the area, knowing the enemy, utilizing all our air and naval skill, the commander developed his plan to capture only a few key positions on the way to the Philippines. Now, against these key positions, the pattern of attack. First, heavy preparatory fire to soften up the objective. Next, the landing. These were varied, unpredictable. In each case, the selection was dictated by strategy rather than by sympathetic terrain. There were many beaches. Some were ideal, hardly more than a matter of getting one's feet wet. Meanwhile, the gain was tremendous, the enemy never having expected us to come ashore here. There were other shores, many of them wicked. Sometimes the attack was in frail craft, sitting ducks for the enemy if surprise had not been accomplished. On another beach, amphibious tractors. Continually the envelopment, the flank attack, decisions, difficult ones, boldly made, based upon unique knowledge and experience. In addition, a mastery by MacArthur of combined operations of the three arms, the key to modern warfare. Leaders and men shared the glow of victory. Losses on the Allied side were relatively small, since damaging frontal assaults were avoided. But thousands of Japanese, prepared to fight to the death, were rarely given this opportunity. Although many were captured, thousands more were isolated, their supply and communication lines destroyed. In the words of the strategist who conceived and carried out the plan, the main body of the enemy was left to wither on the vine. To the outside world, to many who saw the newsreels, the progress being made by the general was admired and applauded. But to those who understood MacArthur, they saw beneath every move his determination to return to the Philippines. This to him was a moral obligation. These islands, a second home and a place where he had left his comrades, were to be the springboard for ultimate victory over Japan. Invasions in the Southwest Pacific continued. To the commander, these hard-fought steps zigzagging along the coast of New Guinea were preliminaries, necessary ones. Finally, having gained the northwestern end of the island, with thousands of the enemy bypassed, there was no question in his mind as to the next objective. But the president, the commander-in-chief, was not so sure. In a meeting at Hawaii in 1944, "Where do we go from here, Douglas? Shall it be Formosa or the Philippines?" In the discussion with Admiral Nimitz and the president, there were many urgent military reasons for the choice presented. And one less tangible reason for going into the Philippines presented by MacArthur. On moral grounds, we had to return to support the Filipinos, our allies and friends. The decision was made. Lady Gulf, 41 years before, as a newly commissioned engineer, Lieutenant MacArthur had made a survey of this area, its potentiality and needs in case of war. Now, 2 miles off the starboard, was Leyte again. Once more, the enemy had not been ready for an attack. The commander watched with growing gratification. With the help of guerrilla intelligence and sabotage, Americans held the beachhead, encircling and surprising the enemy. Now on the beaches of Leyte, a seemingly limitless supply of LSTs, men, and equipment, the result of carefully laid plans. Directing the attack, the general seemed to be everywhere at once. Every day, at some point in the front lines, his men would spot the familiar faded field marshal's cap and the outsized corncob pipe. The landings at Leyte and Lingayen Gulf finally brought troops on the final difficult leg of the journey, on the road to Manila, where the going became more difficult as the enemy threw in huge numbers of reinforcements in an all-out effort to halt the steady advance. There was no timetable now in MacArthur's mind, only that he must get to Manila without delay to rescue prisoners from the reported increasing savagery of the Japanese guard. In Manila, the fighting was block by block. Troops found what the leader had told them to expect. The enemy had dug in for a long siege. To the general, this was the return. This was the climax of the mission to which he was so deeply dedicated. And now, Corregidor. Stronghold, which early in the war had been so effective a fortress for withstanding attack, was now his. Finally, while civilians celebrated joyfully at one end of the city, and the enemy still fought bitterly at the other, MacArthur entered Manila. He had kept the soldiers' faith. Probably his greatest reward was the visit to prison camps. Santo Tomas, Bilibid, Cabanatuan, Los Baños. A series of daring surprise raids had rescued every prisoner held by the Japanese. I'm a little late, he said, but we finally came. Once more, Corregidor and the Philippines were under an American flag. Then, suddenly and swiftly, the war against Japan was brought to a close. As the principal architect of the Pacific victory, credited by the Chief of Britain's wartime Imperial General Staff as the greatest general of the war, MacArthur was the natural choice as supreme commander to enforce the surrender terms. Aboard the battleship Missouri, an awesome ceremony was to take place, one which reflected the deep awareness of a great soldier, his understanding of war and peace, and the historic moment that this was.
It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past. A world founded upon faith and understanding. A world dedicated to the dignity of man and the fulfillment of his most cherished wish for freedom, tolerance, and justice. Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world and that God will preserve it always. These proceedings are closed.
Now began one of the strangest occupations of any land by any conqueror. An idealist with firm convictions on the way democracy can be presented to Eastern peoples, MacArthur determined to guide the Japanese through a complete social revolution. While the emperor with his deep hold upon the people was retained, almost every other institution became affected by what was entirely new to the Japanese, Western democracy. The ideas caught on under the sure leadership of MacArthur. There was the enactment of a constitution and universal suffrage. The National Diet, highest organ of state power, became responsible to the people. Monopolies were broken up. Land reform was instituted, which transformed tenants into owners. These rural capitalists became a strong bulwark against communism. In Japan, the social reforms urged by MacArthur proved one of the most successful experiments in history. An implacable enemy became a friend. During the occupation, the people took him to their hearts, and his family as well. His wife, she who had been beside her husband at Corregidor, and their young son, Arthur. The work of reform was going ahead when suddenly a huge military force swept down from North Korea across the 38th parallel. Handfuls of Americans serving as occupation troops in Japan were flown into South Korea in a rapid show of strength aimed at showing greater resources than actually were at hand. The strategy worked. The North Koreans ran into resistance, bogged down, waiting for more troops and artillery, while reinforcements poured into South Korea to turn the tide of battle. During the ensuing months, General MacArthur guided the war as Commander-in-Chief of United Nations forces in Korea. Again, he studied the fighting at close range, a man in his 70s, visiting battlefields as dauntlessly as he had many years before when a young officer in France. Then came the daring amphibious attack at Incheon, behind the enemy's lines on a shore that others had declared too risky. The landing was a complete surprise and success. The North Korean army was demoralized. The victory has become recognized as a masterpiece of strategy. Seoul returned to its rightful inhabitants. There had been a long line of cities and towns returned under MacArthur's leadership. It was at this time that President Truman cited MacArthur for his vision, his judgment, his indomitable will, his unshakable faith. The Korean War continued northward. The orders were the destruction of the North Korean armed forces. And then the Chinese communists entered the conflict, posing new questions in Washington, not only military but political. While carrying out what he considered to be his duty as Supreme Commander, the pursuit of victory on the battlefield, General MacArthur came into conflict with those he served. His long and distinguished military career was suddenly brought to a close in an official order from the President, Commander-in-Chief of the Military Forces of the United States. He was homeward bound for the first time in 14 years. The San Francisco reception was the largest, the most vociferous the city had ever known. The hero was home from the wars at last and deserving the deepest respect and gratitude of the people he had served. In the midst of the ovation, the husband graciously acknowledged that he had not stood alone.
That this is not only my beloved wife,
but my best soldier.
In the nation's capital, greater than all the medals and honors of his career, was this final tremendous tribute. And then General MacArthur stepped down from the great panorama of history in which he had figured so brilliantly with a soldier's words spoken from a soldier's heart.
The world has turned over many times since I took the oath on the plain at West Point, and the hopes and dreams have long since vanished. But I still remember the refrain of one of the most popular barrack ballads of that day, which proclaimed most proudly that old soldiers never die. They just fade away. And like the old soldier of that ballad, I now close my military career and just fade away. An old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty. Goodbye.